This talk is called State of WikiCite for some tradition because we've had similar talks in the past. And so I also highlighted in green that kind of disappears on this background that there are some updates on which I will focus. In doing so, I will basically keep in mind three main perspectives: that of community, of content, and collaboration. And I'll mainly look at trends that apply since we had the WikiCite conference about a year ago. Next slide, please. So an important initial thing to report on is that there is a next WikiCite report, the latest in a series that started around 2016. And that has lots of details about what happened since about mid-2020 until August this year, when the WikiCite grant from the Sloan Foundation ended. You can find the report on Commons, and you can also find it on Zenodo, and of course there is a Wikidata entry for it. The main highlights are that we had this WikiCite virtual conference last year, and then that we had these two grant schemes, the project grants and the engagement fellowships, that allowed a distributed kind of event to happen in which people chose their time and location and their topic to work on, and with whom they collaborated, but it was all WikiCite themed, and you can find the details on the individual projects in this report. In the following, next slide please, I will not dive deeper into that particular report, but I will really go back into some of those basic questions, redefining WikiCite and looking at the trends. Next slide please. So, what is WikiCite? This is actually a slide that was presented at Wikimania this year, where we had a similar session. And so the definition that we have here that is derived from previous definitions: a home for the community and projects focused on a collaborative approach to representing, curating, using, sharing open bibliographic and citation metadata on the Wikimedia projects. I highlighted the community here because that comes first, and that is important. And I also highlighted the on because that's something that is actually changing. That's one of the trends. Next slide, please. So if we look around in the landscape, we see that lots of things that are relevant to WikiCite actually do not happen directly in Wikimedia projects, but they happen around it, which is why I would like to suggest that we think in terms of adapting this definition such that WikiCite is seen as something that happens in alignment with Wikimedia projects. Next slide. And in terms of alignment with Wikimedia projects, we of course should keep in mind what those Wikimedia projects have chosen as their direction for future development. And yes, we have the overall Wikimedia strategy, but here I will focus, since it's WikidataCon, I'll focus basically on the Wikidata and Wikibase part. And those, well, there were some files and documents recently released, and I take some inspiration from them. Next slide. So, the main ways in which initiatives can be aligned with Wikimedia projects is by being Wikimedia projects or hosted on Wikimedia projects, then by taking place in the Wikibase ecosystem or in the linked open data lab, as was shown in the previous illustration. So now we will look into these in some more detail. Next slide. So This graphic that you see in the background, where Wikisite data is in the center and around it is the Wikibase ecosystem, then the wider linked open data space, that is some kind of the theme of much of WikidataCon and much of Wikis Site. And here I will zoom in on just the part that concerns the Wikimedia projects. So for instance, here's an example that is actually described in the Wikis Site report, where Wikimedians from the Hausa Wikipedia came together to collect references and improve citations in articles on the Hausa Wikipedia. And the topic they did this for was Hausa folklore. And so that's kind of where we came from, this kind of enrichment of the Wikimedia projects and their need to have verifiable sources, or to make the claims in the Wikimedia projects verifiable and based on reliable resources. Next slide. Beyond the Wikimedia projects, there are a number of initiatives, of which I want to just mention the Wiki Library Manifesto, which kind of bridges between the Wikimedia ecobase and linked open data web ecosystem. Next slide. So this manifesto is basically an initiative by a number of libraries that want to build an international network of knowledge that is much aligned with Wikimedia's and Wikidata's strategy for sharing the sum of human knowledge and bibliographic metadata and so on. And so this is, and Wikibase plays an important role in this Wiki Library initiative. Okay, next slide. Now that we have looked at, next slide please. Now that we've looked at the levels of, okay, there was an important one in between, actually, that there, go back one, I'm sorry for the confusion. Yes, so right now in parallel, there's actually running a Wikibase track. So an entire track of this WikidataCon dedicated to all sorts of things Wikibase. I encourage you to check that out. Of course, you can't easily handle two talks in parallel, but many of the things are being recorded, and so I encourage you to check that out. It's really, there's a lot of things happening in this space, and the rising prominence of Wikibase is probably one of the main trends that we should keep in mind when thinking about future developments in Wiki Site context. Next slide. Yeah, and as an example for initiatives that span across the Wikimedia ecosystem, Wikibase ecosystem, and the linked open data web, I'd like to mention CitationJS. That is a software tool that can basically convert between different citation formats, and it is fully integrated with certain workflows in Wikidata, and it can be used in places that basically are not aware of Wikidata at all. And it is based on open standards, just the way we would like for the open ecosystem to work. Next slide. So now we have started with the community aspect of it, and now the next thing I would like to highlight is the content for which I've highlighted here, the open bibliographic and citation metadata. Next slide. So this is a bit busy as a slide. So basically the table has rows for different, basically Wikidata queries, and the three right-hand columns are from different points in time. So the second column here, WikiCite 2020, was at the WikiCite conference. Then next one, Wikimania this year, which was in August 21. The WikiCite 2020 was in September last year. So the second and third column are separated by about 1 year. And then the fourth column is basically now. And I put a link here. You can get there and check what Scholia tells you. Now what I want to look at is the changes, for which I've added a color code. So instead of just looking at the numbers on their own, we can see that between WikiCite 2020 and Wikimania 2021, there was an increase of about 50% actually, in terms of the links from works to authors, to educator, to the place where the authors of works have been educated, and also links from authors to their employers. So statements on the items about the authors as to where they were educated, and statements on the items about the authors as to where they work, basically. From Wikimania 2021 to now, there was no dramatic increase, but this is just 2 months instead of a year. And so this might actually be that they keep a similar pace to what they have done over the last year. It's just, it hasn't accelerated yet. And so in the data that we have, it's not, or at least in that, at that resolution as it's presented here, that's not visible. In yellow, we have a number of things where we see also considerable changes. So the link from work items to the topics that the works are about, they have seen a growth of about 20% over the last year, basically. And interestingly, in absolute numbers, the same number of annotations have happened over the last year as over the last 2 months. So topic annotation is really accelerating, or at least there is something happening there. We can look into that later. And also worth noting is that the links from works to authors, they're growing steadily, such that they are essentially now growing at the same pace as the author strings, which basically are created automatically when tools import metadata for works. When we create new items for articles or other publications, then the author strings are often used to represent who the authors were, because initially we often don't know who that was. And of course, the order of magnitude of the author strings is still like one more than the one for the identified authors, but at least the pace of change is now roughly comparable. And then in blue, I've highlighted some things where there were just minor changes at the scale at which we're looking at here. And so we see, yes, the author strings, they're still growing. The works to authors, they're also growing, and also integration of ORCID is still going on. So this was bibliographic metadata, the current state of open bibliographic metadata. So WikiCite is about open bibliographic and citation metadata. That's why on the next slide we look at citation metadata. Next slide, yeah, okay. So here it's essentially the same setup. It's different queries basically, and but the second to fourth column are essentially the same. I just replaced them by dates because I hadn't included these data or all of that into the previous presentations, which is why I linked to the wiki pages from where you can get those data. So in terms of citations, the cites property, we've had an increase by about 100 million over a year. And over the last 2 months, the progress there has been basically at a similar scale. So the citations are growing quite considerably, and they are large already. Then I'm looking at a number of other properties that are related to citations. So for instance, stated in was growing at about 10% and is still kind of on track to do so at present. And what this means is stated in requires an item as its object. So basically, the item must exist that is used to support this particular statement. Yeah, stated in is used in references as a qualifier, basically. And so that is one use of the items that serve as references. Then there are some other properties. For instance, open citations is a large graph of open citations, and Wikidata is synchronizing with that graph to some extent. But right now we see the number is not very high. So in open citations, they have hundreds of millions of entries, whereas in terms of individual citations, whereas here we have only like 500,000 works synchronized to them. Then there are, for instance, things that are often used in botany and zoology. You see the numbers are smaller, but still growing. And then we also have some new things popping up from time to time. So a recent example is the standard citation forms identifier. And here we see that once it was proposed, it was imported, and then there was no change over the last 2 months. That's kind of okay, but that kind of hints at a potential problem that someone is doing an import and then it's not clear who's going to do the maintenance. In that respect, the botanist author abbreviation is also interesting because here the numbers actually went down by 9, not a lot, which is probably because of duplicate detection and then disambiguation and basically data quality, data cleanup. Okay, next slide, please. So now that we have had a look at the community and the content, I would like to just remind that the definition also includes projects, which is why we're going to look at one. Next slide, please. So here we have this Gov directory project that tries to basically catalog government entities, starting with Sweden, and of course things that are very relevant to WikiCite, like libraries, are part of that corpus. And also, it's interesting here because it has a number of, it is based entirely on Wikidata. You can see it as a Wikidata frontend, essentially. And it has the edit button, edit on Wikidata, and it also has something marked in yellow, which basically is an invitation to curation. So the data model here expects a director, and the director of the National Library of Sweden is the National Librarian of Sweden as a role, but not as an individual. And I think here the data model needs some more refinement. That's the kind of thing which we as a community need to work on and need to coordinate on. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so from there we want to go then, and I'm highlighting the last piece of this definition. That's the collaborative approach to representing, curating, using, and sharing basically WikiCite data. So next slide. Yeah, so we have collaborative workflows. So I just took the recent changes to a WikiCite property. So P1476 is for title that is used on works like books, journals, articles, movies, and patents, whatever, clinical trials. And you see that there's a number of people and also a number of pages involved, and very prominently the project chat. And so we have mechanisms by which we can collaborate. We can all work on the things that use this particular WikiCite property. Next slide. But what is more of a challenge is to actually coordinate those collaborative workflows. So the project chat is one option to do that. But here I have an example where 3 editors were editing the same item over the span of like 15, 20 minutes in a coordinated fashion. And that is something that I think we would need much more of, but that I don't see enough, which is why I would like for us to consider the options that we have here. How can we make this more normal? How can we get people together to coordinate in such a way on a more frequent basis, and also based on parameters that they choose, like we can coordinate around a topic or a property or other things, like, for instance, things that a particular item is linked to, or we could coordinate by language or by just time zone when we have a free time slot. There are lots of ways in which we could coordinate. And I think that's something where WikiCite would benefit from improvements. Next slide. Yeah. Then, in terms of coordination, we have Wiki project source metadata, which is essentially the Wiki site home on Wikidata. The reason why this Wiki project source metadata has this complex name is because at some point early in the history, we needed a place to store metadata about articles for which we uploaded the supplementary video and audio files or supplementary media files in general to Commons. And by that time, Wikidata was fresh. And so we just thought, okay, why not use Wikidata for that? And since the purpose of our use of Wikidata here was to keep track of the metadata of the sources of those media files, that's how we named the project. But that is a bit of a mouthful, and it also creates problems in terms of like what to capitalize and so on. And so WikiCite, once that abbreviation was introduced, became much more popular. And there has been a proposal to rename Wiki project source metadata on Wikidata into Wiki project WikiCite or into just WikiCite, but we haven't made a decision on that. And so, yeah, this is just one of the things in which we could coordinate. We also do not have a coordinated to-do list across WikiCite, or even subsets thereof. On the other hand, we do have a number of channels. Here I've copied those from the Meta page. So on Meta, we have a talk that on Meta, the page is actually named WikiCite, and then in the talk page it comes with it. We have an email discussion group, we have a Telegram group, we have a Twitter handle and a Twitter hashtag. And then there are also generic mailing lists that are relevant because they have lots of things related to WikiCite. That's the Wikidata mailing list, the Wikimedia and Libraries mailing list, and Wikidata and GLAM, Facebook groups. And then there is also an affiliate organization, the Wikimedia and Libraries user group. So these are all mechanisms by which different levels of coordination take place, or different kinds of coordination take place at different times and in different contexts. But overall, if you're new to WikiCite and you want to find out about this, it's hard to find your way. And I think we should put some effort into rethinking how we could organize better structuring of this kind of collaboration. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so how could this look like? So for instance, we could think about Crosswiki integration of the handling of citations. And here there is the proposal shared citations that has been made. And there will be a presentation on it directly afterwards. The basic idea here is that we're using citations on essentially all the wikis, and if a particular reference is cited in a particular wiki page on a particular wiki, then this is done by way of the metadata. And if the same reference is then cited on another page on the same wiki, we could reuse that metadata. Or if the same reference is cited on another wiki, we could in principle also reuse that metadata, just the way we do it for images that we host on Commons. And that is kind of the basic idea behind Wiki Site initially, and also behind this shared citations project. Then other things we could coordinate around would be gathering information about the nature of citations. So why is something cited? Is it cited in a positive, like a positive example, or as a negative example, or is it cited such that the authors of, like the authors who are citing want to express that they build on the work that they are citing? There's an entire citation ontology, and we could make more use of that to express the way different works are linked. Then we can think more about how citations can be linked with other bits of information. So for instance, you might, this is also quite closely linked to the citation ontology approach. So if you're citing a paper, you might actually wish to cite a component of that paper. This might be a particular hypothesis, for instance, that is expressed in the paper, or a particular finding, a particular result, a particular method, a particular data point, or just a particular quote. And all of these things right now, we are keeping track of them occasionally, but not in a systematic fashion. But I think it would enrich the WikiCite ecosystem if we would find workflows and mechanisms, or maybe even pilot use cases where we dig deeper into those connections between the citations and the things that they're citing. And that would involve work on data models. So we would need to work more on the types of entities that can be cited, for instance, the data sets, software, specimens, and other things that can be cited. We need to work on the data models for how they're cited, like this citation ontology, and also different kinds of relationships between the cited and citing entities. And then also we could think about how do we visualize that? How do we use that kind of information? Can we think about mechanisms by which an indicator in WikiCite of why a particular work was cited from another work, how that could be reused in, for instance, a Wikipedia article or something like this. Yeah, and then in general, we don't even have tooling for coordination of curation workflows. So we have lots of tooling, and lots of that is for curation workflows, even collaborative curation workflows. You can have multiple people using essentially the same tooling or related tooling to work on related items or even the same items and so on. But we don't really have good tools for coordinating that. We have often effects where we are stepping on each other's toes by using, let's say, the same computational resources, for instance, but we don't really have good mechanisms and tooling for coordinating, like, for instance, to see, oh, so-and-so is planning to do X, Y, Z in like 2 hours from now, or 3 days from now, or 5 minutes from now, or has been doing it for 3 weeks or something like this. And that's why resource XYZ is now more or less available than usual or something like this. All of this is difficult to find out about. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so far we only looked at basically internal matters of WikiCite, the community, the contents, and the collaborative workflows. But we can also zoom out a little bit and then see WikiCite as a large part of Wikidata. So next slide, please. This large part manifests itself in this figure that you can find on Wikidata Statistics, which basically says that about, at least according to that point in time when the figure was gathered, about 1/3 of the articles was, no, 1/3 of the entities in Wikidata were scholarly articles, and Then there are some other classes that stick out: the humans, astronomical objects, occurrences, architectural structures, taxa, administrative territorial entities, and so on, chemical compounds. And since Wikidata is growing and experiencing growing pains and reaching certain technical limits, one of the options that is being discussed is to split certain parts off of Wikidata. And yeah, next slide, please. If we split off anything from Wikidata, and basically the first candidate would be something WikiCite for the moment, then we need to consider what does this mean for the aspects we've looked at so far, like community, content, collaborative workflows. So imagine we were to split off a particular subset of Wikidata, let's say all the scholarly articles. Then what does this mean for the community of people who are contributing to that set, for the community of people who are using this kind of information? Then if we split off the content, then, for instance, what does it mean for the people who are using this stated as property, or who want to easily add a reference to a statement on Wikidata or on another wiki? And the collaborative workflows, so suppose we split it off into another database, then the work in that other database needs to be synchronized with what happens in Wikidata and in the other parts of the WikiCite ecosystem. And so there is no easy answer to these questions. And so I would like to invite you to join the panel discussion later today at 15:30 UTC on just this topic, what to think of the split and how to engineer it, or how to discuss it, how to approach this topic. Next slide. Yeah, there are some more things happening in this WikiCite track that I would like to call your attention to. So you can still sign up for lightning talks that start at 13:40 UTC. And then after the split off discussion, we will have a WikiCite open discussion that will discuss, or that is open for any aspect of WikiCite, not just the split off. Okay, next slide. Yeah, with that, I would like to acknowledge that WikiCite was fortunate to receive funding from the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation, from the Alfred Sloan Foundation, from Crossref, and from the Simons Foundation, and it also received support from the Wikimedia Foundation, and of course it is based on the work that the editors and the developers and the community organizers do around Wikimedia projects, around Wikibase, and also around the linked open data ecosystem in general. Next slide. Yeah, now I would like to thank you for your attention, and we can now open the discussion. Looking forward to the Q&A, and I think Simon will moderate. I see the public chat has like 60 things. I will not go through the chat. I will wait for Simon to coordinate.
Okay, you're just going to have to give me a second to get up to speed because I'm sharing my screen and I haven't been following the chat, but bear with me and I will catch up and give you some questions, Daniel. So first question I can see is, does Cite already allow topic annotations?
I don't actually know, but I suspect someone who does know is on the call. So I would just hand this question over. I haven't used it in this way.
anyone on the call able to comment on that, or shall we move on to the next question?
I would say if someone knows about it, they just put it in the chat. And then
okay, that's fine. So we'll keep moving. So, question from Toby: what tools are we missing? I think that's quite a broad and interesting question.
Yeah, well, there's a long list of tools that have been proposed or discussed in the context of the community wish list. Most of those things have never made it to the top that received developer attention. That's one starting point. I tried to outline a few, like today, especially focusing on coordination. Of course, there's also an area that I didn't touch upon too much, like data quality. So we have mechanisms that are looking at the recent changes stream. We have mechanisms that look at constraint violations. We have mechanisms that look at internal logic, for instance, between properties and their inverse properties. But if you go onto an individual item, or let's say a particular area, let's say the hippocampus as the brain, the part of the brain, and I want to know, like, what are the main issues of data quality in this space? I have currently no way of doing this as a normal Wikidata editor. So making it easier to identify areas that need curation, then also to identify like what kinds of curation are needed and where expertise or experience, at least, with this kind of curation sits in the ecosystem. Those tools would be useful.
So another general question is, what are the best things you saw in 2021? I think that's a good question, because there is a lot of stuff going on that's really interesting, but as it's not as visible anymore because there's not this big growth, but there's still some great work going on in the community.
Well, I think what I actually like best is the diversity. So in, let's say, in 2017 or so, we had a handful of projects that were reasonably well known, or it was easy to get an overview. But nowadays, I can say I'm still very active in WikiCite space, but I'm discovering something at least every week, and sometimes several things a day that I didn't know about that happen in the WikiCite ecosystem. And I think this is an indication that we have relatively healthy organic growth in the system, and we should really try to keep that going and look at mechanisms by which we can support it, and also mechanisms by which we can help those who are new or who are doing something new in this space to make their efforts or their the results, or even the issues on which they're stuck, known to the community, so that others can engage. If someone's writing a tool and nobody knows about it, that's bad. And so we should think about mechanisms, how we can help people who don't know about those channels. We have many of those channels, and people who have been developing tools for a long time, they know how to reach out and they quickly get volunteer testers. But if you're new to the system, it's sometimes really hard to find out how to engage.
Thank you for that, Daniel. Just before I ask the next question, can I just encourage the attendees to keep on putting questions in the chat? We've got a bit of time, so now's the time to ask those questions. But we have another great question here. Was the large increase in the number of citations because we've been more active and have better tools, or is it because of the publishers opening up their citation data?
These are actually parallel developments, and I think for the moment it is essentially up to one person or small team around James Hare at the Internet Archive who are running a bot, citation bot, on Wikidata, and that bot is actually not running at full speed because of the performance problems on Wikidata, and it had taken a long pause for various reasons as well. But in essence, it has a bus factor of about 1. And so it's not a stable thing. On the other hand, yes, there is movement in the scholarly citation space, and Wikidata was involved in that early on. And now, basically, most of the major publishers are sharing their citations in a way that is compatible with Wikidata. So if Wikidata wanted it, at least legally we would now be allowed. And now the Wikidata community, WikiCite community, can have a discussion as to what part of that do we actually want, do we need, and if we want it, then do we want it in Wikidata, do we want it somewhere else, do we want it now or in 5 years or in 10 years or something like this. That's up for discussion.
Thank you for that one. So another good question: are there researchers who use WikiCite to find out what already exists? So is anyone known to be using the WikiCite corpus as a scientific database for doing their literature searches?
I am not aware of anyone doing this other than like us ourselves. So I personally do it, but there are a number of difficulties actually. So suppose you were to do it that way, then you run into the problem: how can you actually cite the corpus that you were using? Because you can say, okay, I did this query on that day and I got these results back. But then how do you document that? And also, if someone else is running the same query like a few minutes later or a day later or a week later, it might give you different results. And so we haven't really come to the point where you can easily, let's say, save the results of a Wikidata query along with the query in a way that makes the query reproducible. So this could be achieved by, for instance, having the query service run over a dump. And then if you're that researcher, you just say, oh, I was using the dump, I was using that query. You can then still have some element like if there is a random aspect in your query, or if you're sorting by some parameter and you have multiple things with the same value, then there's an arbitrary cutoff, so or an arbitrary ordering for this things that have the same value. So results may never be entirely complete, but we could make them more reproducible. And also, it wouldn't be too much of a problem, for instance, to have a plugin that allows to post the results of your Wikidata query service query to something like Zenodo. Just another button, and then it would be posted to Zenodo, and then it would be citable immediately. And people would know, oh yeah, that's the result that they got, and then you can engage with either the result that they got, or you can investigate the method. But to your question about to what extent we can actually use it for browsing the literature, there are a number of both issues and opportunities in here. We tend to focus on the issues sometimes, or at least in the Scholar team, we focus on the issues for a long time. But there are also opportunities. Some of the issues are that right now the coverage is very uneven. So you might be lucky in a certain field, like the Zika virus or even COVID-19. There is a decent percentage of the relevant literature that is indexed in Wikidata. But by index, I initially just mean that the items are there. In order to make them relevant for your search, you need to annotate them as well. So you need to link the work items to the author items. You need to link the author items to the institutions and so on. You also need to link to work items to the topic and so on. And for many of those things, we do not really have good tooling yet. It's steadily improving, but still it doesn't work at the scale that we would need. And even if we had it at the scale that we would need, it might actually be too much of the scale for Wikidata. And so it's problematic. On the other hand, I see lots of opportunities. For instance, you could use it, well, if in certain pilot contexts, you could use a query in a non-English language, for instance, to browse the literature which is predominantly in English. And so, or you could combine a query to Wikidata and structured data on commons to get maybe figures from articles that meet certain criteria that you define in Wikidata, like people who studied subject X at University Y or something like this, which is not easily possible on using other search engines. Yeah, or for instance, if you want to particularly focus on diversity and underrepresented minorities, you can make use of the information that Wikidata has about these things, or these groups, or these people, or these, let's say, subject matters, and then run queries that give you lists of things to look up in other databases, be it in Commons, be it in scholarly reference databases, and so on. And depending on what your particular use case is, Wikidata can actually deliver some of that already. I personally use it, for instance, on a regular basis when I try to find a reviewer for a scientific paper. And sometimes this means that I first have to curate the publications in that area a little bit, but often it already gives me something out of the box.
Thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer, Daniel. I suppose you mentioned that you're using the corpus for searches, but I think you've got the advantage of knowing where there are gaps and understanding the biases, which I think that would be a risk if someone just approached this corpus without understanding that and started doing their literature searching. And I guess that's something that we need to address as a community going forward as well, just to help people understand what they're using rather than just saying, we've got this corpus of 40 million scholarly articles, here you go.
Yeah, but we have the advantage that we can actually be open about our gaps. The other tools that are being used in this space, they're not open in general, but also they're not open about where they are weak. But Wikidata can be very open about the areas in which it is weak, and then we can use that to engage the relevant communities to reduce those weaknesses and to make that part of Wikidata or WikiCite more useful to those communities. And that's an aspect that those other scholarly databases don't care much about.
Yeah, that's very true. And let's move on to the next question. That is, how do you keep track of authors' employers? Do you mind LinkedIn?
I don't mind LinkedIn, and I don't think we would be allowed to. It's certainly not public domain data, and so basically it's hands off. Yeah, well, employers is a difficult question because it has a number of connotations. It basically means you're employed if there is a working contract between the institution and you. But those contracts are almost never public, and also there's very rarely something in a, let's say, reliable source that actually provides that information in a way that's verifiable. Sometimes if let's say, a big name person gets hired to some department, that new department will issue a press release, look, we just hired big name person so-and-so, and then, okay, you have a data point, but also those press releases, they don't survive for long. And if that big name then moves on to the next institution, then the next institution might issue a similar notification, but the institution that they were at for a certain period, they rarely issue a press release when someone leaves. And for a normal person, like not a big name, essentially you have no reliable information as to when they started or ended working for some particular employer. And so all of this information is messy. On the other hand, we have tools like ORCID that in principle address this. But ORCID has a range of problems that also they affect the way we work on Wikidata. So first, most researchers don't have an ORCID still, even those that are eligible. Then everybody who died before 2012 basically is not eligible anyway. Then those who do have an ORCID profile, they often don't have any content in it. If they do have content, it's not public. And if it's public, it often does not have persistent identifiers like DOIs. And so there are different layers of problems associated with it. All of these can be addressed to some extent, but not necessarily by us, but by interaction with the relevant communities. And then, even there, even if it's all public and so on, the statement as to whether someone was employed, and that statement in ORCID is still not verifiable by anyone other than the people who actually have access to the work contract. And so ORCID is essentially a self-publishing platform where you publish metadata about people, and that has its own problems. Another problem is that ORCID is also fed by some automated mechanisms that often conflate people with the same name or similar names. That's especially common for like Chinese names spelled in Latin letters. So you can easily find, especially when you curate those authors on Wikidata, you can easily find people who have thousands of publications. And if you then dig deeper into that, it actually turns out, yeah, that's different people. And sometimes they actually work even in different fields, but the most difficult issues are when they work in similar fields or even in the same fields. And then the automated mechanism, or they might even have, like, there are some people with popular names, they might actually share some collaborators, and the algorithms are confused about this. And yeah, that affects employer information. It also affects other relationships in the network, like co-author relationships, for instance, or the relationship between doctoral advisor and a doctoral student.